Now, good news tomorrow, probably, for those of us that are trying to pay off a home loan because we borrowed too much because that house was just so much more beautiful than the one that we were already in. Well, this is something that about 30% of Australians know something about. 30% of Australia is paying off the house they're living in, 30% is paying off is renting, and another 30% have already paid off their home. So tomorrow, the expectation is that when the Reserve Bank meets again, they're going to cut rates.
Markets today are still pricing in 3 interest rate cuts this year. Tomorrow, that's the first.
I would say that, all bets are probably on rate cut tomorrow.
I think the RBA will deliver one tomorrow.
Well, the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee meets this week and it looks like there'll be a rate cut.
All of the big 4 banks are expecting the Reserve Bank to cut the official rate tomorrow.
Now, the reality is that in all of the wreckage of the federal election, there is one thing that was absolutely clear. That third of Australia that was paying off its mortgage was under maximum stress. It had had 13 interest rates since the start of things back in May of 2022. February, it ever so slightly dropped, but the financial pain still remains absolutely huge. You know that, and I know that. And to give you an illustration of this being probably the most significant group that made its movement and change of mind during the election, before the rate cut, the Liberal Party was leading, according to Redbridge, with those whom were paying off their homes, 51 to 49. After the rate cut in February, it became 50-50. After the panic around the Trump tariffs, which of course resulted in a stock market fall that has now been completely erased. In fact, the market is higher than when it started to fall, but don't tell anyone. By then it was too late. Because the Labor Party had taken a lead 53-47 and eventually 55-45 with people who were paying off their homes. And debt was a point that I was trying to make to you last week, but we got interrupted by live events. So I want to continue on with that point about how debt does and doesn't play a role in modern Australian politics. Now, Jim Chalmers, as we know, made a lot of debt when he was the shadow treasurer, $1 trillion of Liberal debt, $1 trillion of Liberal debt. But you know now that this year, Australia racks up $1 trillion of debt under the Labor Party. It then becomes almost 1.1, then it becomes 1.1, then it becomes $1.2 trillion in and around the time of the next federal election. And for those of us who know what the consequences of debt is for a country, look at countries like Greece, look at a whole bunch of other ones around the world, we know that eventually, when it comes knocking, there's going to be problems. In fact, tomorrow will also be an interesting economic document that will be the Victorian budget. You see, they have operated under this modern Labor idea of modern monetary thinking, which essentially means that governments can rack up as much debt as possible because it's good debt. Now, of course, the good debt would normally be spent on things like infrastructure, but increasingly, the Australian federal budget, in fact, almost 40% of the Australian federal budget is paying off welfare. We also know that many, if not most, of the major promises that were made by the government at the last election were all going to increase that amount of debt. In Victoria, they've played this politics for a long time and it has worked electorally for them for a long time. But the results are now going to be that public servants are going to get the chop tomorrow. There will probably be a whole series of tax increases, and we'll see how this looks like on the other side. Because one thing that is absolute about this Labor Party that has been handsomely re-elected in Canberra is that they are going to follow the triangle of dependence. This is where you either work for the government, so any suggestion on cutting back on public servants is enough to scare a significant part of the population. You are reliant on the government for a handout, and therefore any change to the amount of handouts somehow can be written up as a threat to your handout. Or if you're in private business, then the biggest customer to your private business is the government. Hence why in Victoria, we have a scenario where essentially if you're in private business or if you're in small business, you're surplus to the needs of the permanent state that is dependence on the state that has been created for the best part of 30 years, bar one term, for the best part of 30 years in Victoria. We'll see whether there is a price to be paid or whether people will continue going down this road where we know where it's all going to end up. But the reality about debt and Australian politics is that perhaps it is a little too much to assume that the average voter is going to vote on the national finances when they are all so deeply in debt themselves. Let me show you this graph here from Macro Business. It shows you here about the number of Australians and the percentage of the income in terms of their household debt. Now, in 2024, it's the best part of 200% of the amount of money that's going to come into the household is how much you have to spend when it comes to your debts. This can be everything from the house that you live in to the car that you're driving, perhaps the second property. The same when it comes to disposable income. That the debt for people there is at 120% of the money that is coming in. And when you have a look at the percentage of wages that are required to pay off your mortgage, again, a group that I had some faith in, but they ended up having faith in the current government rather than changing the government after those 13 interest rate rises, more than 50% of every paycheck that comes into a third of the country that is paying off its mortgage goes on paying the mortgage. Let's compare this to, say, 10 years ago when it was about 35%. It's now half. So in many ways, when the federal government knows that we as individuals borrow as much as we possibly can to the absolute hilt, and then sometimes we borrow against what we are already borrowing to borrow more to get more stuff, then there's no expectation that when the federal government is putting together its own finances, that Australians demand that the federal government is more well-behaved than we are. But make no mistake, the federal government and the federal budget is in a world of pain. It is in what we call a structural deficit because of the decisions that have been made by this government to increase its spending, and despite the huge increases in population that we will get between now and when it'll be about 2060 and it'll be 40 million people living in the country, this is how many budget deficits the Treasurer thinks we are going to produce. One every single year for the next 40 years. You add one deficit on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, on top of another before we even go into this red rectangle of debt, it's $1.2 trillion that we owe. If all of this becomes true over the next 40 years, that number will end up at $2 trillion in debt. This is despite the fact that the tax base will be growing because they're going to keep adding more people. Because the Labor Party was able to successfully weaponise any conversation about migration as being something about every person who has emigrated to Australia. It's not true. It wasn't true when the arguments were being made during the election, and it won't be true when the arguments are being made between now and the next election. Because despite the fact that Australia's population, according to the Bureau of Statistics, and they have 3 models here, that show us high immigration, where basically the post-COVID years keep running, and then we end up with a population that is the best part of what, more than 45 million people? Or maybe it's kind of where they hope it's going to be in the next little while, and it ends up being 39 million people. Or for some reason, they're able to halve the number of people that are currently coming in, and it ends up being 34 million people by the 2070s. The federal government will still be running a deficit. The population now is at 27. Even if it was at 45 million people, the government would still be running a budget deficit. This matters. There will be a reckoning. I don't want there to be a reckoning. I don't want there to be that bad day. But modern politicians of the left believe that they can just keep borrowing because as long as they have something to announce or something to give away at an election, we will keep re-electing the same people who are doing fundamental damage to the Australian economy. Voters sent a very clear message at the election that they just don't care. And maybe that is because even the very people who have paid tens of thousands of dollars more on their mortgage in the first 3 years of the Labor government, they still believed that they were the best people to run the economy for the next 3 years. Well, the reality is that we will get more of the same. And while interest rates will now start to trickle down, and I will cheer down every single one of these as a person who is trying to pay off a mortgage that, yes, is too big, even when you have a dream job like this and a beautiful house that I want to have for my wife and kids, The reality is that the story of Australia will continue to be a lot of pain for a lot of people. When that ever turns into a political problem for politicians is when we will start to learn our lesson. But till then, the lesson is going to need to be learnt, and it's going to hurt a lot of people.